The Italian front during World War I was a place of brutal struggle, where soldiers fought not only against enemy forces, but also against the unforgiving elements of nature. One of the most dangerous and unexpected enemies in the Alps was the snow. In the winter of 1916, the snowstorms in the Dolomite Mountains created deadly conditions for the soldiers stationed there. As the cold winter deepened, the snow began to pile up at alarming rates. By the beginning of December, snowdrifts in the region reached up to 10 feet, blocking roads, cutting off supply lines, and making movement nearly impossible. The Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies were both entrenched in these mountains, locked in a desperate struggle, where both sides faced not only gunfire but also the crushing weight of the snow and ice. The men in these remote mountain positions were ill-equipped to handle such extreme cold. Most soldiers wore clothing that offered little protection against frostbite and hypothermia, leaving them vulnerable to the bitter chill that could freeze their bodies in an instant. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians living in the foothills of the mountains were equally at risk. Whole villages were isolated, cut off by snow-blocked roads with no access to medical care or food supplies. The conditions were so harsh that soldiers sometimes froze to death in their foxholes, unable to protect themselves from the cold. Others were left stranded for days without proper supplies, as heavy snowfalls blocked any attempts to bring in more resources. The isolation was not just physical, but psychological as well. These men were stuck in an environment that seemed to work against them at every turn. Every moment of every day felt like a struggle for survival. In the middle of these harsh conditions, a deadly force was quietly building up in the snow-packed mountains. The Dolomites, with their steep slopes and unpredictable weather, were a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The snow had been accumulating for weeks, and with each new storm, the snowpacks became more unstable. With temperatures fluctuating wildly between freezing cold and brief thaws, the conditions were perfect for an avalanche. Avalanches were nothing new in the mountains, but no one could have anticipated the scale of destruction that would be unleashed on December 13th of 1916. It's not entirely clear why or how the avalanches happened that day, but many factors contributed. Some reports suggest that the snowpacks had been weakened by shelling. Both sides were so desperate to bury their enemies that they may have fired shells at the snow in an attempt to trigger an avalanche, though no one can say for certain how much this contributed to the event. What is known is that the avalanches came suddenly, without warning, and with terrifying force. The day of the avalanches has since been remembered as White Friday, despite the fact that it took place on a Wednesday. The term was coined because the disaster was so horrific that it became a day marked in history. For those who lived through it, however, the memory of that day was forever tied to chaos, fear, and unimaginable loss. As we will see, the scale of destruction that followed was unlike anything the soldiers had prepared for, but the full extent of the tragedy would not become clear until much later. The soldiers and civilians trapped in the avalanche's path were left to deal with the aftermath in ways that few had ever experienced before. As the morning of December 13th, 1916 dawned over the Dolomites, no one could have predicted the disaster that was about to strike. The soldiers stationed in the mountain barracks had grown used to the harsh conditions, but even they couldn't have been prepared for what nature was about to unleash. The Austro-Hungarian barracks on Mount Marmolada, one of the most significant targets during the conflict, sat at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Built in the summer of 1916, the barracks had been strategically placed atop the Grand Pose summit, out of reach from high-angle mortar fire and in a location that seemed secure from attack. But despite the location's strategic advantages, the barracks were vulnerable to something far more deadly than enemy artillery: avalanches. The snow, which had been accumulating for weeks, had reached dangerous depths. In the days leading up to the avalanche, the weather had been erratic. The sudden thaw that had followed a period of heavy snowfall only weakened the snowpacks further, making them ripe for disaster. While the soldiers were preoccupied with the ongoing war and the cold, they weren't aware that the snow was on the verge of collapse. The Austro-Hungarian commander, Captain Rudolf Schmid, recognized the growing danger. He feared the snow was becoming unstable and that his position would soon become untenable. On December 9th, Captain Schmid sent a request to his superior, Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig Geuginger, asking to vacate the barracks before disaster struck. However, his request was denied and his unit was left in place. It wasn't just the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian barracks who were at risk. The Italian divisions positioned in the mountains were equally vulnerable. While the Austro-Hungarians had made some attempts to prepare for the worst, the Italians had no such plans in place. Their soldiers were spread out along the peaks and valleys, unaware that the snow in the higher altitudes was becoming a ticking time bomb. As the day wore on, the conditions in the mountains only worsened. Heavy snow continued to fall, and by the time the sun began to set, the unstable snowpack on Mount Marmolada was on the verge of collapse. The soldiers, who had been working in freezing temperatures for days on end, now faced the full force of nature's wrath. What they didn't know was that the avalanche was only moments away. When the avalanche finally hit, it came down with an overwhelming force. It swept across the mountainside, overwhelming everything in its path. The snow came crashing down so violently that it seemed like the entire mountain was shaking. The barracks on Mount Marmolada were directly in the path of the avalanche, and within moments, the entire structure was buried beneath tons of snow. The force of the avalanche was so strong that it not only buried the barracks, but also destroyed everything around it. The soldiers who had been stationed there had no chance to escape. The avalanche didn't stop there. In fact, it was just the first of several that would strike on that fateful day. The snow continued to fall, and avalanches triggered by the unstable snowpack would hit other areas, including Italian positions and other Austro-Hungarian sites. The destruction was catastrophic, with hundreds of men buried alive beneath the snow. The impact was immediate and devastating. The soldiers, caught off guard by the avalanche's power, struggled to dig their comrades out from beneath the snow, but time was against them. The snow was too deep and the wreckage too vast. By the end of the day, the full scale of the tragedy had begun to reveal itself. Hundreds of soldiers had been killed or trapped, and the avalanche's impact had spread far beyond Mount Marmolada. The snow, which had once seemed like a silent enemy, had become a violent and unrelenting force, taking the lives of thousands. The death toll was not fully realized in the immediate aftermath, but estimates suggest that the total number of casualties, including those who died in subsequent avalanches, may have been in the thousands. For those who survived, the sense of chaos and terror was overwhelming. They were left to dig through the snow, searching for any sign of life among the wreckage. As the survivors tried to recover from the disaster, the snowstorms continued, making any rescue efforts almost impossible. And while the snow continued to fall, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. The avalanche that had struck on December 13th was one of the worst in history, marking a devastating chapter in the story of the Italian front during World War I. But for those trapped in the mountains, the battle for survival had just begun. The aftermath of the White Friday avalanches was nothing short of horrific. As December 13th, 1916 drew to a close, the full extent of the devastation slowly began to emerge. What had started as an ordinary winter's day on the Italian front quickly escalated into one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. In the wake of the avalanches, the landscape had been completely transformed. The once pristine mountains of the Dolomites were now a chaotic, treacherous sight. The snow had buried everything in its path, buildings, equipment, and men, leaving the soldiers and civilians trapped under tons of snow and debris. Entire units had been wiped out, and those who survived found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The search for survivors was a desperate and grueling task. Rescue operations were nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath. The snow was too deep, the conditions too dangerous, and the cold too intense. Those who survived the initial wave of avalanches were left to dig through the snow, searching for any signs of life among the wreckage. But with no tools and limited resources, the chances of finding anyone alive seemed slim. The soldiers who had been stationed at the barracks on Mount Marmolada had no time to prepare. They were buried under snow so quickly that many didn't even have the chance to flee. Even for those who managed to survive the initial avalanche, the struggle for life had only just begun. The freezing temperatures and lack of supplies made survival increasingly difficult as the hours passed. Hypothermia set in quickly, and many soldiers, trapped under the snow, slowly succumbed to the cold. It wasn't just the soldiers in the immediate vicinity of Mount Marmolada who were affected. Other Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions further down the front were also struck by avalanches on the same day. As the snow swept down the mountainsides, entire companies were swept away. The devastation was widespread, affecting both sides of the conflict. The chaos was compounded by the heavy snowfall and the ongoing risk of additional avalanches. No one was safe from nature's fury. The terror didn't end with the initial avalanche. After the first wave hit, additional avalanches continued to fall throughout the region, catching more men off guard. While some soldiers were able to escape the worst of the disaster, many found themselves trapped under piles of snow, struggling to breathe and find their bearings. They faced the relentless onslaught of snow and ice, each moment feeling like a battle for survival. The snowstorms that had caused the avalanches showed no signs of letting up, and the constant threat of more avalanches loomed over the soldiers. Visibility was reduced to nearly nothing, and in the thick, heavy snow, any attempt at a coordinated rescue was futile. The soldiers who had been caught in the disaster were left to rely on their instincts, digging through the snow with bare hands, hoping to find any sign of life. In addition to the avalanche's physical toll, the emotional strain on the soldiers was immense. They were not only fighting against the elements, but also dealing with the shock of losing comrades. The cries for help could be heard in the distance, but with no way to reach the trapped soldiers in time, the helplessness was overwhelming. For many, the scene was one of total chaos. Soldiers frantically searching for survivors, while others succumbed to the cold and the weight of the snow. The total number of casualties was impossible to determine in the immediate aftermath, as so many soldiers were still missing or buried under the snow. Estimates later placed the death toll at over 2,000 soldiers, with some accounts suggesting that the number could be much higher. Civilian casualties, though fewer, also added to the tragedy as the avalanches devastated nearby towns and villages. It wasn't just the soldiers who paid the price for nature's fury. The surrounding civilian population also suffered, trapped by the same snowstorm that claimed the soldiers' lives. In the days following the avalanche, the full scale of the disaster continued to unfold. With no clear way to communicate and supplies running low, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a turning point in the war itself. The avalanche had wiped out significant portions of the Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, forcing both sides to regroup and rethink their strategies. While the avalanches may have been caused by natural forces, the devastation they caused was made worse by the circumstances of the war. The soldiers, already weakened by months of fighting in the harsh winter conditions, were now facing an even more insidious enemy, nature itself. The avalanche, like the war, showed no mercy, and its consequences would ripple through the lives of all who were affected for years to come. The White Friday avalanches were a stark reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the power it holds over the course of human history. While the soldiers on the front lines fought bravely against the enemy, they could not have predicted that nature itself would be their greatest adversary. For those who lived through the avalanche, the memories of that terrible day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And for the families of the soldiers who perished, the pain of loss would linger, never truly fading. The consequences of the White Friday avalanches weren't just felt in the immediate aftermath, but stretched on for weeks, months, and even years. The scale of the disaster left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the soldiers, civilians, and the wider region. The destruction of entire military units and the loss of so many lives served as a grim reminder of how nature can reshape the course of history, especially in the midst of war. In the aftermath of December 13, 1916, both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces had to reevaluate their positions. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the avalanches, and the war effort was severely impacted. The men who survived found themselves not only grappling with the loss of comrades, but also trying to make sense of how such a catastrophe could occur. The snow, which had been a silent and ever-present force in the mountains, had suddenly become a terrifying enemy. The surviving soldiers were forced to deal with the physical toll of the avalanche. Many had been trapped under tons of snow for hours, some even longer, before they were rescued. They were frostbitten, exhausted, and traumatized, often suffering from injuries sustained during the avalanche. The freezing temperatures and lack of proper medical supplies made their recovery slow and painful. Even those who had escaped the avalanche with relatively minor injuries were left mentally scarred, haunted by the memories of that day. The emotional trauma was equally devastating. Those who had survived found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of their former comrades and struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. Many soldiers had spent months on the front lines, enduring grueling conditions, but nothing could have prepared them for the horrors of the avalanche. The cries for help, the sight of men being buried alive in snow, and the chaos of trying to rescue the trapped, all of these elements would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On the civilian side, the situation was just as dire. Entire villages and towns had been cut off by the snow, and many residents found themselves without basic necessities. The avalanches not only disrupted military operations, but also led to a breakdown in the local infrastructure. Roads were blocked and communication lines were severed. The civilians who lived in the areas surrounding the Dolomites were left to fend for themselves, facing the same brutal conditions as the soldiers. As the recovery effort began, it became clear just how massive the damage was. The avalanche had affected both sides of the conflict, with the total number of casualties reaching into the thousands. But the true scale of the destruction was not immediately apparent. In many areas, rescue teams struggled to reach the buried soldiers and civilians. The snow was simply too deep, and the risk of further avalanches kept many teams from venturing into the worst-hit areas. Those who were trapped under the snow had little hope of survival without immediate help. Over time, some of the survivors were able to make their way out of the disaster zones, though they were often in poor condition. As news of the avalanche spread, the rest of the world began to learn of the tragedy. The incident became known as the White Friday Avalanches, and it was soon clear that it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. While the conflict of World War I continued to rage, the memory of the avalanches remained an ever-present shadow, reminding those who survived just how fragile life can be in the face of nature's fury. In the years that followed, the effects of the disaster would continue to reverberate. The loss of so many soldiers impacted both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces in ways that were hard to quantify. Many of the men who survived the avalanches were physically and mentally broken, and they struggled to continue their military duties. Some would later be sent to different fronts or even return home, unable to carry on in the same capacity. The avalanches of December 13th, 1916 didn't just change the lives of those directly affected. They were a stark reminder to future generations about the power of nature and the unpredictable ways it can alter the course of human history. As the survivors moved on with their lives, many chose to honor the memory of their fallen comrades, and the event itself would be remembered annually, marked by a somber observance on St. Lucy's Day. Yet for those who had been caught in the path of the avalanche, it remained a haunting memory of nature's merciless hand in a time of war. As we reflect on the events of White Friday, it's essential to remember that the disaster wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a turning point in the way both soldiers and civilians interacted with the harsh alpine landscape. It serves as a reminder that nature can be as unpredictable and devastating as any enemy army, and that the forces of the natural world must never be underestimated. The White Friday avalanches of December 13th, 1916 remain one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike during a time of war. The tragic events not only left a lasting mark on the soldiers and civilians caught in their path, but they also changed the way avalanches were understood and handled in the future. What began as a bitter winter turned into one of the deadliest days in the history of avalanches, and the impact would be felt long after the snow had settled. In the aftermath, the full scale of the disaster gradually came into focus. The death toll was staggering, with thousands of soldiers and civilians lost in the snow. The grief was immeasurable, as entire units and villages were wiped out in a matter of hours. But alongside the devastation, there were also stories of incredible survival. Those who had managed to escape the avalanches found themselves dealing with injuries, trauma, and the overwhelming sense of loss. For many, the memory of that day would never leave them, serving as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change when nature unleashes its fury. In the years following the disaster, the White Friday avalanches would be remembered not only as a military tragedy, but also as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable power of the natural world. For those who lived through it, the memory of the avalanche's terrifying roar and the deafening silence that followed was something they could never forget. The soldiers who survived would carry the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives, and their stories became an integral part of the history of World War I. Efforts to rebuild after the disaster were slow and difficult. In many areas, the damage to infrastructure was so severe that it took years for normal life to resume. But even as the physical landscape was repaired, the emotional toll on the survivors and the families of the fallen would never fully heal. In time, the event would be commemorated every year on St. Lucy's Day, not just as a way of remembering the loss of life, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such unimaginable devastation. The White Friday avalanches of 1916 may have been a tragedy, but they also served as a reminder of the unpredictable and often uncontrollable forces of nature. They taught us that no matter how advanced our technology or how strong our will, we are still at the mercy of the natural world. And in this case, The avalanche reminded everyone involved in that brutal war that no matter how hard the human spirit fights, nature itself can be the ultimate victor. As we reflect on this terrible moment in history, it's crucial to honor the memory of those who perished in the snow, whether they were soldiers, civilians, or anyone caught in the avalanche's path. Their sacrifices, both on the battlefield and in the face of nature's wrath, should never be forgotten. And as we continue to study the lessons of the White Friday avalanches, we are reminded once again that nature, in all its beauty and danger, remains one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past as we uncovered the chilling history of the White Friday avalanches. If you have any thoughts or reflections on this story, feel free to share them in the comments, and be sure to check out more historical stories as we continue to explore the moments that shaped our world. Florence, a city known for its breathtaking art, rich history, and stunning architecture, was forever changed on the 4th of November 1966. The Arno River, which had peacefully flowed through the city for centuries, suddenly became a force of destruction, swallowing streets, homes, and even priceless works of art. It was a disaster of unimaginable proportions, one that caught nearly everyone off guard. The flooding didn't happen all at once. In the days leading up to the disaster, heavy rainfall had been pounding the region. The soil, already saturated from weeks of continuous rain, could no longer absorb the water. The river levels began to rise steadily, but at first there was little alarm. Florence, like many historic cities, had experienced minor floods before, but what was about to happen was unlike anything the city had seen in centuries. Upstream from Florence, two major dams, Lavane and La Penna, were struggling to contain the massive amounts of water flowing into them. On the 3rd of November, both dams were forced to release water at an unprecedented rate, sending a surge of floodwater rushing toward the city. By the afternoon, the Civil Engineering Department had already issued warnings about an exceptional quantity of water moving downstream, but by then it was too late for meaningful action. The first areas to experience flooding were the low-lying neighborhoods near the riverbanks. Cellars and basements in districts like Santa Croce and San Frediano were the first to take on water. For many residents, this still didn't seem like an emergency. After all, water seeping into basements wasn't uncommon in older parts of the city. But by the time night fell, it became clear that this was no ordinary flood. Emergency calls flooded into the local police stations, with frantic villagers upstream reporting rising water levels at an alarming rate. The problem wasn't just the amount of water, but the speed at which it was moving. It wasn't a slow, creeping flood. It was a rushing, violent surge carrying debris, tree branches, and even parts of destroyed structures along with it. By the early hours of November 4th, engineers at the Valdarno Dam made a desperate decision. Fearing that the dam itself might collapse under the pressure, they released a massive wave of water downstream. What followed was catastrophic. The powerful current reached the outskirts of Florence in the early morning, traveling at speeds of nearly 60 kilometers per hour. Residents who had gone to bed unaware of the looming disaster woke up to find water already rising around their homes. By the time the sun came up, the city was in chaos. The Arno had overflowed, turning Florence into a massive lake. Streets became rivers, cars, market stalls, and even entire sections of buildings were swept away. The water moved with such force that even some of Florence's stone bridges were at risk of being damaged. Landmarks, centuries-old churches, and museums that had stood for generations were now drowning beneath the raging flood. As the water levels continued to rise, the city's infrastructure began to collapse. By 7:26 in the morning, gas, electricity, and water supplies were cut off to large portions of Florence. By 8 o'clock, even military barracks had been overtaken by the flood. Hospitals, already struggling to function, lost power as their emergency generators failed. Landslides blocked roads leading in and out of the city, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Florence was now completely divided in two. Those on one side of the Arno could not reach the other, and with phone lines down, communication was limited. People were trapped on rooftops, waving desperately for help as the streets below turned into raging torrents. And for many, there was nowhere to go. But the worst was still to come. The rising floodwaters weren't just carrying debris, they were also spreading something far more dangerous: oil. The powerful current ruptured underground heating oil tanks, mixing thick black oil with the muddy water. This made the flood even more destructive, coating everything it touched in a toxic sludge that would take years to fully clean. By mid-morning, Florence was unrecognizable. The iconic Piazza del Duomo was underwater. Shops and businesses had been completely submerged. Priceless paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts were now floating in the flood, carried away by the unforgiving current. The people of Florence were left with only one choice: survive. Many waded through waist-deep, ice-cold water to help their neighbors. Others formed makeshift rescue teams, using whatever boats or floating objects they could find to save those trapped in their homes. But with the water still rising, many feared it would only get worse. As the floodwaters continued their assault, the full scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Florence was in crisis, and it would take the courage of its citizens and the help of the world to pull it back from the brink. As the sun rose over Florence on the 4th of November, 1966, the city was already in a state of catastrophe. Entire streets had disappeared beneath the raging floodwaters, homes were destroyed, and thousands of people were trapped with nowhere to go. But as the morning wore on, the true scale of the disaster became even more horrifying. For those who had survived the initial surge of water, the nightmare was far from over. The force of the flood had created a dangerous current, sweeping away anything in its path. Debris, broken furniture, and even entire sections of buildings were being carried through the streets, turning the city into an unpredictable and hazardous landscape. Those who tried to escape by wading through the water found themselves struggling against a relentless current, often only able to reach safety by clinging to floating objects or climbing onto rooftops. Rescue efforts were nearly impossible in the early hours of the disaster. Emergency services were overwhelmed, with roads blocked by landslides and floodwaters too strong to navigate. Even the fire department, trained for extreme situations, found itself unable to respond effectively. The historic streets of Florence, which had once been filled with tourists and locals enjoying the beauty of the city, were now an unrecognizable, debris-filled wasteland. The water itself presented an even greater threat. It wasn't just a flood of rainwater, it was a toxic mix of mud, sewage, and oil. The destruction of underground storage tanks had released thousands of gallons of heating oil into the flood, creating a thick, black sludge that coated everything it touched. Buildings, bridges, and even the priceless artwork stored in Florence's museums were now covered in an oily film that would make restoration efforts far more difficult. By mid-morning, it was clear that Florence's most treasured landmarks were in grave danger. The Uffizi Gallery, home to some of the world's most important works of Renaissance art, was at risk of losing irreplaceable pieces. In the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, Italy's most important library, the floodwaters had reached the storage vaults, where centuries-old books and manuscripts were now floating, soaked, and covered in mud. The Ponte Vecchio, one of Florence's most iconic structures, had miraculously survived the force of the rushing river, but the small artisan shops that lined it were completely devastated. As the flood progressed, those who had once doubted the severity of the storm were now facing a grim reality. Many residents had chosen to stay in their homes, believing the waters would recede quickly, but instead the flood continued to rise, leaving thousands stranded. For some, their only option was to break through rooftops to escape the rising water. Others, trapped inside buildings, desperately signaled for help from windows and balconies, hoping someone would come to their aid. The lack of communication made the situation even worse. With phone lines down and power outages across the city, it was nearly impossible for residents to call for help. Many had no way of knowing what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. Was the flood still rising? Had help arrived? Was there anywhere safe to go? These were questions no one could answer. Despite the overwhelming destruction, acts of bravery and solidarity began to emerge. Strangers helped each other escape flooded buildings, carrying those who could not swim or navigate the treacherous waters. Shop owners, despite their own losses, worked together to salvage what they could, passing valuables to higher ground in a desperate attempt to save their livelihoods. Those who had boats or makeshift rafts worked tirelessly to transport people to safety, even as the current threatened to pull them under. As the day went on, government officials scrambled to respond, but with roads blocked and infrastructure crippled, there was little they could do immediately. The military was called in to assist, but even their resources were stretched thin. It was becoming clear that Florence would need more than just local efforts to recover from this catastrophe. It would require international assistance, expertise, and a level of restoration work that had never been attempted before. By the evening of the 4th of November, Florence was a city in crisis. Thousands of families were homeless, their possessions lost to the flood. Businesses that had stood for generations were reduced to ruins, but perhaps most devastating of all was the loss of the city's cultural heritage. Museums, libraries, and churches, places that had preserved Florence's history for centuries, were now left in ruins, their priceless treasures buried under layers of mud and oil. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, the people of Florence refused to give up. The flood had tested the city in ways it had never been tested before, but the response in the days to come would show the world that Florence's spirit was far stronger than the forces of nature that had tried to bring it down. As the floodwaters in Florence slowly began to recede on the 5th of November, 1966, the true devastation became painfully clear. Streets were unrecognizable, buried under thick layers of mud and debris. Cars were overturned, buildings were gutted, and in many places the air was thick with the smell of oil and sewage. The damage was not just physical, it was emotional. Florence, a city known for its beauty and history, now looked like a war zone. For those who had survived the terrifying rise of the water, the ordeal was far from over. Thousands of families had lost everything. Their homes were either severely damaged or completely uninhabitable, filled with sludge and contaminated by oil. Many people had no choice but to seek shelter in temporary relief centers, churches, or the homes of those lucky enough to remain dry. Basic necessities like food, clean water, and medical supplies were scarce, and with transportation routes still blocked, getting aid into the city was a massive challenge. One of the most heartbreaking losses was to Florence's cultural heritage. Inside the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, one of Italy's most treasured libraries, the destruction was overwhelming. Millions of books and manuscripts, some dating back centuries, were soaked through with muddy water. Many pages were so delicate that even touching them caused further damage. Historic churches, including the Basilica of Santa Croce, were in ruins. Frescoes, paintings, and sculptures that had survived for generations were now covered in grime, some completely dislodged from their original places. The loss was immeasurable, and the question on everyone's mind was, could Florence ever recover? In the midst of despair, however, something remarkable began to happen. People from all over Italy and beyond started arriving in Florence, determined to help in any way they could. Among them were students, historians, artists, and volunteers from around the world, later known as the Mud Angels. They came armed with buckets, sponges, and an unwavering determination to save Florence's treasures. The work was grueling. Thousands of people spent hours carefully removing books from the library, peeling apart wet pages one by one and laying them out to dry. In museums and churches, teams worked tirelessly to wipe away oil from paintings and lift statues out of the mud. Every effort was made to preserve what could be saved, but time was against them. Some pieces were so fragile that they started to disintegrate before restoration efforts could even begin. Outside of the cultural institutions, Florence's residents were also trying to rebuild their lives. Shop owners dug through the wreckage of their businesses, hoping to salvage anything of value. Homeowners shoveled mud from their doorways, determined to reclaim what remained of their property. The city's hospitals, still struggling with the aftermath of the disaster, treated cases of infections and illnesses caused by contaminated water. While the local government did its best to coordinate relief efforts, it quickly became clear that this was not a disaster that Florence could recover from alone. Appeals were made for international aid, and soon resources started to trickle in. Other European nations sent emergency funding and supplies, while conservation experts from around the world offered their skills in restoring damaged artworks and manuscripts. Even private citizens, moved by the plight of Florence, donated whatever they could to help the city rebuild. Despite these efforts, there was no quick solution to the crisis. Florence had suffered not just a temporary flood, but a catastrophe that would leave scars for decades. Many of the businesses destroyed by the flood would never reopen. The families who had lost their homes faced an uncertain future, and the priceless artifacts damaged by the water and oil would take years, if not lifetimes, to fully restore. By the end of the first week after the flood, Florence was still in chaos, but the determination to recover was stronger than ever. The people of the city, along with thousands of volunteers, had already begun the long process of rebuilding. There was still a monumental amount of work ahead, but one thing was certain: Florence would not be abandoned to the flood. In the weeks following the flood, Florence faced the monumental task of rebuilding. The immediate crisis had passed, but the city was far from recovery. Piles of debris lined the streets, and the thick, oily mud left behind by the floodwaters hardened like cement, making cleanup even more difficult. Residents, volunteers, and workers labored tirelessly, scraping layers of filth from the city's historic stonework and hauling away ruined furniture, books, and artwork. The Italian government declared a state of emergency and allocated funds to help the city recover, but the damage was overwhelming. The economic loss was staggering. Thousands of businesses had been wiped out, and thousands of families were left with nothing. Banks and financial institutions worked to provide relief, offering low-interest loans and financial assistance to those affected. However, for many small business owners and local artisans, the flood meant the end of their livelihoods. The city's economy, deeply rooted in tourism and trade, took a heavy hit. The cultural loss was equally severe. The extent of the damage to Florence's historical treasures was unlike anything the art world had ever seen. Some paintings and sculptures had been shattered or washed away entirely, never to be recovered. Books and manuscripts from the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale and other archives remained at risk of disintegration. The flood had coated delicate frescoes and priceless paintings with a mixture of water, oil, and mud, making restoration incredibly complicated. But Florence refused to be defeated. As international aid poured in, restoration efforts gained momentum. Experts from across the globe came to help. Using innovative conservation techniques to rescue and preserve damaged artworks, laboratories were established to carefully clean and restore pieces that had been thought lost. The flood also sparked a new era in the art conservation field, leading to advancements in techniques that are still used today. One of the most ambitious efforts was the restoration of Cimabue's crucifix, an iconic 13th century painting that had absorbed so much water, it was nearly destroyed. Specialists spent years painstakingly reconstructing what they could, and while the damage was irreversible, their work ensured the piece would not be lost entirely. The same dedication was applied to countless other works of art, manuscripts, and historical artifacts. As the months passed, Florence began to rebuild, but the scars of the disaster remained. Many families who had lost their homes struggled to return to normal life. The once bustling markets and businesses slowly reopened, but not all of them survived. The city's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and public services, required extensive repairs. Some of the most flood-damaged areas took years to fully recover. The Arno River, which had brought such devastation, became a symbol of both destruction and resilience. In the years after the flood, Florence invested heavily in flood prevention measures. Dams and reservoirs upstream were reinforced, and new drainage systems were put in place to better manage rising water levels. The disaster had exposed the city's vulnerabilities, and officials were determined to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. Today, the memory of the 1966 flood lives on in Florence. Markers throughout the city indicate how high the floodwaters rose, a sobering reminder of the disaster that once submerged the streets. Survivors still share their stories, and the Mud Angels are remembered for their extraordinary efforts. The flood left an indelible mark on Florence, changing the city forever. But in the end, Florence endured. Through the determination of its people, the generosity of volunteers, and the support of the world, the city rose from the depths of destruction. Though much was lost, much was also saved, and the spirit of Florence remains as strong as ever. The city of Messina, located on the northeastern coast of Sicily, Italy, was once a thriving metropolis known for its rich history, beautiful architecture, and vibrant culture. But on the morning of December 28, 1908, everything changed. What was once a bustling city full of life was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in history, forever altering its fate. Messina had long been in a region known for seismic activity. It sits on the edge of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, making it prone to earthquakes. However, despite this knowledge, the city was not prepared for what was to come. The buildings were constructed with outdated methods and materials that weren't designed to withstand the force of such a powerful earthquake. Streets were narrow, and the infrastructure was old, making the city particularly vulnerable when disaster struck. The fact that most of the population was still asleep when the earthquake hit only worsened the situation, leaving people trapped in their homes and buildings before they even had a chance to react. The earthquake itself struck with devastating force at around 5:30 in the morning. It was a massive 7.1 magnitude quake, but the destruction was made worse by the location of its epicenter just off the coast of Sicily. Not only did the earthquake shake the ground with incredible intensity, but it also triggered a massive tsunami that slammed into the coastline, adding to the devastation. Buildings collapsed, fires broke out, and the streets were filled with dust and debris. People were thrown from their beds and entire neighborhoods were destroyed in seconds. It was an event of epic proportions, but what was even more tragic was how unprepared Messina was for such a disaster. The city had no established emergency protocols, and there were no systems in place to effectively warn the public or respond to such a catastrophic event. Many of the buildings that had once stood proudly in the city center were reduced to rubble, and the few buildings that remained standing were severely damaged. Communication systems were knocked out, and emergency services were unable to respond quickly, further complicating the rescue efforts. This lack of preparedness and poor building standards were major contributing factors to the staggering loss of life. It's estimated that over 70,000 people lost their lives in the earthquake, but the number of casualties could have been even higher if not for the incredible efforts of survivors and international rescue teams. The tragedy would forever be etched into the history of Italy and the world, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness and the dangers posed by seismic activity in vulnerable areas. In the following parts, we'll dive deeper into the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the struggles of the survivors, and how the earthquake left its mark on both the city of Messina and the world as a whole. But for now, it's clear that the earthquake of December 28, 1908 not only shattered buildings, but also the lives of thousands of people, forever changing the course of history. As the dust began to settle after the devastating earthquake that struck Messina on December 28, 1908, the scale of the destruction became painfully clear. The once thriving city, full of historical landmarks and elegant architecture, was now nothing more than a pile of rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map, and the few structures that managed to survive were severely damaged. Fires raged in the chaos, adding to the already overwhelming destruction. What was once a bustling city was now a war zone. The first hours after the quake were chaotic. With the city's infrastructure in ruins, communications were nearly impossible. There were no working telephones, no power lines, and no way to quickly coordinate rescue efforts. What made the situation even worse was that the survivors were left to fend for themselves, as no immediate help arrived from local authorities. Rescue teams were unable to access the most heavily affected areas due to the rubble blocking the narrow streets of the city, making it almost impossible to reach those who were trapped beneath the collapsed buildings. People were left stranded without medical assistance, with many injured, some unable to even move. Hospitals were overwhelmed and medical supplies were running low. Surgeons and doctors were forced to operate in makeshift hospitals, often under dire conditions. What made the situation even more tragic was the fact that so many of the city's emergency services were destroyed or non-functional. It was only after several hours that international aid began to arrive, but for many, it was too late. The city had been left to deal with the immediate aftermath on its own. At the same time, the tsunami that had been triggered by the earthquake caused additional chaos along the coast. The waves, which reached up to 3 meters in height, hit the city of Messina and the surrounding areas, further damaging the already fragile coastal structures and sweeping away entire buildings. The powerful waves caused more casualties, and many survivors who had initially escaped the earthquake found themselves caught in the deadly waves. The Italian government's response to the disaster was slow and uncoordinated. It wasn't until hours after the quake struck that any significant help came from the authorities, despite the growing number of people in need of aid. The lack of preparedness in the face of such a massive disaster left the survivors feeling abandoned, with frustration and anger mounting against the government for not acting sooner. Many people turned to neighboring regions and international organizations for help, hoping that outside assistance would provide the support the city so desperately needed. The impact on Messina's economy was equally devastating. With trade and commerce disrupted for weeks, businesses were forced to close their doors. The economic shockwaves rippled through the region, leaving many people unemployed and without basic necessities. The city's ports, which were once vital to its economy, were heavily damaged, making it nearly impossible to ship goods in or out of the region. In addition to the immediate physical damage, the emotional toll on the people of Messina was profound. Families had lost everything: homes, loved ones, and livelihoods. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out, and those who survived were left to rebuild their lives from the ground up. The psychological trauma of the event would linger long after the physical damage had been repaired, leaving deep scars on the collective memory of the people of Messina. As the days passed and more survivors were pulled from the rubble, the world began to take notice of the disaster. International aid poured in from countries around the globe, offering financial assistance, medical supplies, and teams of rescue workers. The international community came together to help Messina, but the Italian government's delayed response left a lasting sense of bitterness among the survivors. The contrast between the swift actions of foreign aid organizations and the slow response of local authorities further highlighted the deficiencies in disaster preparedness and response at the time. While the devastation was undeniable, the people of Messina showed extraordinary resilience in the face of such overwhelming destruction. Despite the lack of immediate aid, the survivors banded together to support one another, forming makeshift communities and organizing efforts to clear the rubble and search for any remaining survivors. Their determination to rebuild their lives amid such a catastrophic event marked the beginning of a long recovery process, one that would take years and require the collective effort of not just Messina, but the entire country. Next, we'll explore the long road to recovery and the challenges that the survivors faced as they struggled to rebuild their city. As the days turned into weeks after the December 28th, 1908 earthquake, the people of Messina faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces of their shattered city. The scale of the destruction was so vast that rebuilding seemed almost impossible. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened, and the once thriving cityscape was now a scene of chaos and ruin. The survivors, however, showed a remarkable sense of determination. They began to organize and take action, working together to clear the rubble and rebuild their lives from scratch. In the aftermath, it was clear that Messina would need more than just physical reconstruction. It would require a complete overhaul of its infrastructure. The lack of strong building codes, which had allowed for the widespread destruction, became glaringly evident. Many of the structures that had collapsed during the earthquake were old and built without proper consideration for seismic activity. In fact, Italy had not yet developed modern, earthquake-resistant building standards, and the devastation of 1908 underscored the urgent need for change. The rebuilding process was slow and grueling. Resources were scarce, and the city's economy had been severely crippled by the disaster. Many people who had lost their homes were left without jobs, and the once bustling port of Messina was no longer functioning. Yet despite these challenges, the people of the city remained resilient. They worked together to clear the streets and rebuild their homes. Starting with makeshift shelters for those who had lost everything, one of the first priorities was to rebuild the infrastructure that had been so crucial to the city's functioning before the earthquake. Roads and bridges needed to be repaired, and the vital railway system which connected Messina to other parts of Italy had been disrupted. Rebuilding the port, which had been one of the city's main economic engines, was another top priority. Without it, Messina would struggle to recover economically. The Italian government, despite its initial slow response, began to take action in the months following the disaster. It provided some financial assistance and began to work with international organizations to help with the recovery process. However, many people still felt that the government's efforts were insufficient and that more could have been done in the immediate aftermath. The international community also continued to provide aid, and countries around the world sent resources, money, and workers to assist with the recovery. As the months passed, the survivors began to slowly rebuild their homes and businesses, but the city's landscape had been permanently altered. The once beautiful historical buildings that lined the streets of Messina were gone, and many of the city's landmarks, which had taken centuries to build, had been reduced to rubble. The loss was not just physical, it was cultural and emotional. The people of Messina were grieving for their city's past as they worked toward its future. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the earthquake also brought about important changes in Italy's approach to disaster preparedness and urban planning. In the years following the disaster, the country began to implement new laws and building codes that would better withstand future earthquakes. The lessons learned from the Messina earthquake would shape Italy's response to natural disasters for generations to come. The recovery effort also highlighted the importance of community support. In the face of overwhelming adversity, the people of Messina came together, relying on each other for help and strength. Many survivors who had lost their families and homes found solace in helping their fellow citizens rebuild. This spirit of cooperation and solidarity would become one of the defining features of Messina's recovery. In addition to physical reconstruction, there was a growing need for psychological support for the survivors. The trauma caused by the earthquake, The loss of loved ones and the destruction of homes left many people struggling to cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. Mental health resources were scarce, and it would take time for many survivors to find a sense of normalcy. As the years passed and Messina slowly began to rise from the rubble, it became evident that the city's recovery would be a long-term process. While the physical rebuilding of homes and infrastructure took priority, the emotional and social recovery of the people was just as important. The disaster had left a deep scar on the city, and it would take generations to heal fully. However, the resilience and determination of the people of Messina ensured that the city would eventually recover and rebuild stronger than before. As we continue, we'll explore the long-term effects of the disaster on Messina's people and the city's transformation in the years following the tragedy. The earthquake of 1908, while a source of great loss, would ultimately be a turning point that reshaped the city in profound ways. The Messina earthquake of December 28, 1908 left a profound impact on the people of the city and the wider region of Sicily. The devastation was not just in the loss of lives and property, but also in the emotional and cultural toll it took on the survivors. As the years went by, the full extent of the disaster's effects on Messina and its people became clearer. The earthquake had altered the city's landscape, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for generations. One of the most significant long-term effects of the earthquake was its influence on urban planning and building regulations in Italy. Before the disaster, Italy had very few regulations in place to protect buildings from earthquakes. The collapse of entire neighborhoods during the earthquake highlighted the need for stricter building codes, particularly in earthquake-prone areas like Messina. In the aftermath, Italy made significant strides in earthquake engineering. New laws were introduced that required buildings to be designed with seismic activity in mind. These changes not only helped protect the people of Messina, but also set a precedent for earthquake-resistant construction across the country. The recovery and rebuilding efforts, although slow and arduous, brought about positive change in some areas. The Italian government and international organizations began working together to improve disaster preparedness, and in the following decades, Italy's approach to handling natural disasters became more structured. This led to the creation of better early warning systems and emergency response strategies. While these efforts came too late to save many lives in 1908, they undoubtedly saved countless others in future earthquakes, including the devastating L'Aquila earthquake of 2009. The lessons learned from Messina influenced how Italy and much of the world would approach natural disasters in the years to come. In addition to the physical and structural changes, the Messina earthquake had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Many people who had lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods struggled to move forward. The trauma of the event was something that could not easily be rebuilt, and it lingered long after the rubble was cleared. Communities had to come together to help each other heal, and families had to cope with grief and loss on a scale that was unimaginable. Counseling and mental health services, while not as developed as they are today, became an essential part of the recovery process. The emotional scars left by the earthquake would take decades to heal fully, and for many, the memories of that fateful day would never be erased. For the city itself, the road to recovery was long. Despite the immense destruction, Messina began to rebuild not just its physical structures, but its identity. The historic center, which had been reduced to rubble, was slowly reconstructed, and new buildings were erected with more modern and earthquake-resistant designs. In the years following the earthquake, Messina also saw new industries and economic opportunities emerge as the city adapted to its new reality. While the scars of the past remained, Messina began to find its place once again on the map of Sicily and Italy. The story of Messina's recovery and transformation is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The city, though scarred, rose from the ashes, much like its people. While the earthquake was a tragedy of immense proportions, it also served as a catalyst for change in how cities and nations prepare for natural disasters. The importance of preparedness, resilient infrastructure, and community support in times of crisis became clear, and the world took notice. The Messina earthquake of 1908 will always be remembered as one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. But beyond the tragedy and loss, it is a reminder of the strength and resilience of the people who lived through it. Their determination to rebuild, recover, and emerge stronger is an inspiring story for future generations. As we reflect on the legacy of the Messina earthquake, we are reminded that natural disasters, while often devastating, can also lead to progress and change. The lessons learned from Messina shaped Italy's approach to disaster response and preparedness, and they continue to guide efforts around the world today. The memory of Messina lives on, not just in the physical landscape, but in the spirit of the people who rebuilt their city and their lives from the ground up. With this final chapter, we conclude our exploration of the Messina Earthquake, a tragedy that altered a city, a nation, and the course of history. We honor the lives lost, the survivors who endured unimaginable hardship, and the lasting impact this earthquake had on disaster preparedness worldwide. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history.